Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming to this event. My name is Bobby Tolbert. I am the secretary for the board of directors of Vocal New York, and it's a pleasure to be here and host you tonight.
The main thing I wanted to talk to you about is, for my book, I traveled like 30,000 miles. I've been to 12 countries, and I want you to know that there is nowhere I went where I saw people doing more inspiring work than the work that you're doing at Vocal NYC. And I want to talk a little bit about why, and why I think you guys reveal something really important about the drug war and the alternatives to it. When I first came and met a lot of you, when I first came and met Bobby, I was actually in quite a bad state. Several people very close to me were in a really bad way with addiction, and I was very depressed. I'd also been through quite a difficult experience myself, and I, to be honest, didn't really think I had it in me to write a book. I felt a bit beaten up. And I came, and the very first person I spoke to, the very first person I interviewed for the book was Elizabeth Owens, who obviously loads of you know. And Elizabeth told me, she showed me around, she told me a lot about her life. A lot of you know, Elizabeth was thrown out by her mother when she was a very young teenager. She developed an addiction problem. She was living on the streets. Doctors said to her, "We don't want to talk to the likes of you." They wouldn't help her. And Elizabeth spent a lot of time in quite deep addiction, on the streets a lot of the time. She ended up living in a shelter, and she met a woman called Jackie, who was one of the security guards at the shelter. And Jackie was a kind of amazing person. She used to get Saks Fifth Avenue to donate clothes for the women. She'd always say to the women, "We're as good as anyone in this city. We're worth as much as anyone that we walk past in the street." And she really helped Elizabeth to think differently about herself. And one day, Jackie was found dead on a roof. She had been using, and as you guys know better than anyone at that time, because of the way the law worked, people were afraid when someone was ODing to call an ambulance. Because if you called an ambulance, the police would come with the ambulance. And if you had been using drugs with the person, you could face a murder charge. So they left Jackie and she died. Like thousands of people died all over the United States for this exact reason. And the thing that most struck me about Elizabeth, right, is at that point in her life, with all that she'd been through, the easiest thing in the world would have been to become bitter and angry and self-pitying. And Elizabeth did something so totally different. She said, "I'm going to use all these experiences to learn how to love people more and how to change things more." She was a key part of the campaign that you guys did to introduce the Good Samaritan law that says if someone calls an ambulance, you will not arrest them for using drugs with a person who's overdosing. Where they'd done that in New Jersey, it had massively saved lives. Elizabeth was one of the leaders of that campaign. You achieved that. You did that. That is an extraordinary thing, but that's not all Elizabeth did. I went with her, you saw her handing out condoms to sex workers, handing out, training people in how to use naloxone. But the thing that most struck me was how she treated people differently, how she treated people so humanly, so differently to how most people in that position are treated. There's a line that another great New Yorker, James Baldwin, said, "The only use for your pain is if it can help you to understand other people's pain."
That's right.
And if it can do that, it can help you to overcome it. And to me, what you do in Vocal NYC embodies that. So I want to talk to you about 3 other people in very different circumstances, somewhat different circumstances, who I think tell you something interesting about Elizabeth, about the work you do. In 1939, 7 blocks away from where we are now, Billie Holiday walked on stage in a hotel where she was not even allowed to walk through the front door because she was an African American. She had to use the service elevator. And she sang a song. The song was called Strange Fruit. Pretty much everyone here knows it. It's a song against lynching. Her goddaughter Lorraine Feather said to me, "You've got to understand how shocking this was, right? This is a time when popular songs were like P.S. I Love You, when there were no African American women who were allowed to take a stand, although they were incredibly brave all over the country." And Billie Holiday sings this anti-lynching song. Years later, someone called it the musical starting gun for the civil rights movement. And that night, she received a warning from a guy called Harry Anslinger, who was the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. And it basically said, "Stop singing this song." Now that might seem like a weird place, I opened my book with this, and it might seem like a weird place to start a story about the war on drugs, right? What's that got to do with the war on drugs? It's absolutely intimate to it. Harry Anslinger is probably the most influential person who no one's ever heard of, right? He takes over the Department of Prohibition just as alcohol prohibition is ending. So he's got this big government department with nothing to do. And partly to keep it going, he decides to build a new mission for this department, and he wants to build it around 2 really intense hatreds that he had. One was a really intense hatred of addicts. He said they were contagious, they needed to be quarantined away from everyone else. and a really intense hatred of African Americans. Go back, this is a guy who was regarded as a crazy racist in the 1930s, right? This is a guy who used the N-word so often in official police memos, his own senator said he should have to resign in the 1930s, right? And Billie Holiday was a symbol of everything that was going wrong with America to him. He said that jazz was like a mongrel music. It brought white people and African Americans together. He said it was the chaos, crazy, you know, like it was the chaos of the jungles being imported, like really hardcore racist stuff. And of course, here was an African American woman saying, "You're not going to treat us like this," which is his nightmare. He decided he was going to destroy her. The first thing he does, he hated employing African Americans, but you couldn't really send a white guy into Harlem to stalk Billie Holiday. It'd be kind of obvious. So he employed a guy called Jimmy Fletcher, and he basically said, follow her everywhere, get evidence she's a drug addict, we're going to break her. And Jimmy Fletcher followed her around for 2 years, and Billie Holiday was so amazing, Jimmy Fletcher fell in love with her. And his whole life, he was really ashamed of what he did next. They busted her, they put her on trial. She said, the trial was called the United States versus Billie Holiday, and that's how it fucking felt. And they put her in prison. She's in prison for 18 months. They made her clean out pigsties. She doesn't sing a word when she's in prison. But what they did next is the cruelest thing. You needed a license to perform anywhere where alcohol was served. And they didn't give her the license. Her friend Yolanda Bavan said to me, what is the cruelest thing you can do to a person? It's to take away the thing they love. It's to take away their ability to work. It's why the campaign you did on Ban the Box is so important. This is what we are doing to addicts all over the world. We put barriers between them and the ability to ever reconnect. And in that situation, we can all guess what happened to Billie Holiday. She relapsed, right? She just wanted to be out of it. This is a woman who was prostituted as a child from when she was 11 years old. And when they caught the men who were paying to rape her, they put her in a reformatory for longer than they put the men in prison for raping her. This is a woman who was trying to stun her grief with heroin, with heavy booze. She does that. And one day, in the early 50s, she collapses and she's taken to hospital. And just like happened to Elizabeth, they said, we don't want a filthy addict, we're not taking her. She was taken to another hospital up in Harlem, and she said to one of her friends that the Federal Bureau of Narcotics were not finished with her. She said, they're going to kill me in there. Don't let them, they're going to kill me. She was right. They handcuffed her to her death, but she was diagnosed with liver cancer, quite advanced liver cancer. They handcuffed her to the bed that they kept her on, and they arrested her on her deathbed. Her friend, she started to go into heroin withdrawal, and her friend Maylie Duffy managed to insist that she was given methadone. Because, you know, it's very dangerous to be in withdrawal when you've got advanced cancer.
That was real heroin like that.
Exactly.
I got that garbage in now.
You're right. They gave her methadone and she started to recover. And 10 days later, they cut off the methadone and she died. One of her friends said she looked like she had been violently wrenched from life. But the thing there's loads of things to think about that. It shows you what the war on drugs was about at the start. It shows you what the war on drugs is about now. It's about persecuting addicts, and it's about persecuting African Americans. At the same time that Harry Anslinger found out that Billie Holiday was a heroin addict, he found out that Judy Garland, Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz, was a heroin addict, which makes you think a bit differently about The Wizard of Oz, but anyway. And with Judy Garland, he told her she should take slightly longer vacations and reassured the studio she was going to be fine. Spot the difference. That is a difference that is playing out in every city in the United States today. And I just want to talk about one other person, because I think it illustrates something so important that you do. One of the things that kind of haunted me, one of my earliest memories is of trying to wake up one of my relatives and not being able to, and 'cause I didn't understand why, but as I got older I realised we had addiction in my family. And one of the things I kind of thought I knew the answer to when I started doing the research that day when I first met Elizabeth was, if you'd asked me, let's say what heroin addiction, so what causes heroin addiction? I think I would have looked at you like you were a bit stupid and I would have said, well, the clue's in the name, right? Heroin addiction is caused by heroin. We've been told a story for 100 years that's just become part of our common sense, right? We think that if the next 20 people to walk past this building, if they all used heroin together for 20 days, because there are chemical hooks in heroin, their bodies would start to physically need it, and that's what addiction is, right? The first thing that alerted me to the fact there's something wrong with that story is when it was explained to me by a doctor. If in Britain or Canada, if you step out into the street and you're hit by a truck or whatever and you break your hip, you're taken to hospital and you're given loads of diamorphine for the pain. Mm-hmm. Diamorphine is heroin, right? It's much better heroin than you ever buy on the streets because it's medically pure as opposed to the shit you buy from dealers. Mm-hmm. And those people are given that for quite a long period of time. Any hospital in Canada or Britain is giving out a lot of... My grandmother was given a hip replacement operation. She was given loads of heroin. If what we think about addiction is right, what should happen? Loads of those people, or at least a significant number of them, should leave hospital as addicts. They're exposed to all the same chemical hooks as any addict you'll see on the street. This has been studied very carefully. It virtually never happens. And when I learned that, I just thought, that's really weird. That can't be right. What's going on? And I only really began to understand it when I went and met this amazing professor of psychology called Bruce Alexander, who explained something to me. Basically, this idea of addiction we've got in our heads comes mostly from a series of experiments that were done earlier in the 20th century. They're really simple experiments. You guys can do them at home if you're feeling a bit sadistic. You get a rat and you put it in a cage and you give it 2 water bottles. One is just water and the other is water laced with either heroin or cocaine. If you do that, the rat almost always prefers the drugged water and almost always kills itself. You might remember the famous advert in the 80s that showed this experiment, right? So there you go, right? That's how we think addiction works. In the 70s, Professor Alexander came along and said, well, hang on a minute. We're putting these rats in an empty cage. They've got nothing to do except use these drugs. What if we did this differently? So Bruce built a cage that's basically heaven for rats, right? He called it Rat Park. And anything a rat could want in life is in Rat Park. It's got loads of friends, it can have loads of sex, it's got loads of cheese, it's got loads of coloured balls, it's got loads of tunnels, and they've got both the bottles, the drugged water and the normal water. And of course they all try both the bottles, they don't know what's in them. This is the fascinating thing. In Rat Park, they don't like the drugged water. They almost never use it. None of them ever use it compulsively. None of them ever overdose. Which seems really odd. I began to think about it. There's lots of human examples that I can tell you about, but I began to think there's a professor in Amsterdam called Peter Cohen who said, we shouldn't even call it addiction, we should call it bonding. Human beings have an innate and natural need to bond. And when we're happy and healthy, we will bond and connect with each other. But if you can't do that because you're traumatized or isolated or beaten down by life, you will bond and connect with something that gives you some sense of meaning. That might be heroin, that might be gambling, that might be porn. You will bond and connect with something and you will keep going back to that bond. The opposite of addiction is not sobriety, the opposite of addiction is connection. And one of the main things that Professor Alexander takes from that is he says, all the time in addiction, we talk about individual recovery. That has real value, it's worth doing. But we need to talk a lot more about social recovery. Something has gone wrong with us, not just as individuals, but as a group. Something has gone wrong with us, our cage. And it's why I think about the work you do, you know, the constant economic justice work that produces such real results. Why that is so, it's important in itself, but it's also the root out of addiction. We've got to end the drug war. The drug war makes all these problems worse. But we've also got to do the other part of what Vocal NYC does. We've got to change the cage. You know, we're living in a shitty cage, a cage that is not well suited for human beings. We've got to change that. And I kept thinking when I learned that about Elizabeth, and the most important thing she does, the Narcan is fantastic. The Narcan is really important. The handing out condoms is really important. But the clean needles are really important. But the most important thing she does, the thing I saw her do, is just love people, sit with them and treat them as human beings and treat them with such care and dignity. And I just wanted to say, you should be so proud of the work you do. It has global significance. It points the way at one of the most cruel and destructive experiments in human history. You know, for 100 years, we have been singing war songs about addicts. You guys are showing the world we should have been singing love songs to them all along. Thank you very much. Thank you.